Welcome to segment 2 of Citizens Forum, being filmed on Tuesday, July the 14th in Victoria, British Columbia. Our guest in this segment is Joanne Roberts. Joanne is the Green Party federal candidate in the riding of actual Victoria. And you'll be running...
Which does include Oak Bay. It's interesting, it's called the riding of Victoria, but it includes Victoria and Oak Bay.
You'll be running against Murray Rankin of the NDP, who's the incumbent. You and I met yesterday, which was Monday, July the 13th, at a small meeting, rally in front of the legislative buildings where Christy Clark and the Liberals are pushing through a horrendous bill dealing with Petronas and natural gas and fracking. So that's where we met, and maybe you can talk a little bit about all of that and how it affects the federal side of things as well.
Well, this is provincial legislation that's being put through. So some might say, well, what's the federal candidate for the Green Party doing there? But it is an example of what happens when, a party, a government says one thing, that they want to be leaders in climate change, for example, which the government here in BC has said, and then passes legislation that will have the opposite effect. And I think this does affect us on a national level, on a federal level, because climate change is an issue that we need to consider right across this country. And so the legislation that Christy Clark is putting through is more or less the tax scheme for one of 5 proposed LNG plants. But it will set the bar. It will be the precedent. And even supporters of this government are calling it horrendous legislation. They're saying this ties the next generation's hands. It is setting a tax regime for 25 years. And what it says is that if, for example, the price of carbon is changed by a future government, it won't affect this deal. And I think we need to start wondering what happens when governments start to sell out the next generation's right to clean air and clean water and an environment that does not see increasing greenhouse gases. So I think that what is happening in the legislature in BC does affect the rest of the country, and it is something we need to be concerned about.
And my main concern about it isn't the financial one, although the financial end of this deal that the Liberals are putting through is a disaster. But for me, it's all about the fracking. I mean, all the gas for this huge scheme will come from fracking, mainly, I think, in northeastern British Columbia. So they're planning to poison us. They're locking us into crazy agreements. And unfortunately, the NDP, which is the party I'm a member of,
yes,
supports fracking and supports LNG. So what's the position,
I think it goes beyond even fracking, though, Jack. I mean, trying to have a healthy environment is not just an environmental issue. It is an economic issue. And I think we're being sold this expansion of fossil fuels and natural gas as an economic issue. We're being told if you don't do this, you don't get jobs. In fact, this plan to put natural gas in BC, if all 5 LNG plants promised by this government are put in place, the permanent direct and indirect jobs are 26,000 jobs. 26,000 jobs. Last month in BC, in June, we added 36,000 jobs to the job numbers in this province. So while 26,000 sounds like a lot, or 24,000 sounds like a lot, in comparison it's not. And yet when you look at it, by expanding fossil fuels in this country, we're not putting money into things that really do make a difference. In our province, it comes down to, good tourism, because our environment provides us with a beautiful place people want to visit. High-tech jobs in, developing new renewables. It goes beyond just, having an electric car and solar panels on your roof. I mean, we know that an economy that supports the environment is an economy that's growing. The fossil fuel industry is dying. The IMF is saying that, and I don't think you can get a much more conservative group. They're saying that this is an industry in decline. And yet the federal government, even the provincial government right now, is investing in this, is saying this is our at least immediate future. even the Clark government is saying this is an interim fuel. But a lot of damage that will last for a lot longer than the industry will is going to be done to have this interim fuel. So I think we need to change the conversation in this country. We need to get away from thinking about this just as, it's the environment or it's the economy. It's about if we don't do this, we don't have jobs. We're exporting most of this, and yet we're paying the price here in BC and right across the country.
So what is the Green Party position on fracking? Is there a
Well, we're opposed to horizontal fracking, yes. And that's in our policy platform. So right across the board.
Okay, so there could not be then an LNG industry here in BC because of that?
Because they do use horizontal fracking.
You mentioned that one issue that was important to you is what you call the democratic deficit, and that's important to me too, because, I really think that the basis of how the country moves ahead or wherever we want to go should be based on what an informed public wants. So first of all, we're not informed because the media you can't trust. But secondly, even when we are informed, it doesn't matter because our political rulers do what they're told, but not by the people, but by the corporations. So what do you mean by democratic deficit, and how do we move ahead?
Well, there's a lot in what you just said, Jack. First thing is I have worked in the media as a journalist for 35 years. So I think there are some members of the media and some journalists that you can trust.
Oh, the people are fine.
But I do agree with you that in a country like ours, where we have massive corporate ownership right now of mainstream media. We have 5 large companies that own the majority of media in this country. We're killing off our independent public broadcaster. The cuts to the CBC in this country have been dramatic. And I've worked for the CBC for the past 20 years, and I can tell you those cuts are diminishing its ability to do the news. But I think democratic deficit goes beyond that. We now know in this country that a party received 39% of the vote and has 100% of the power. And there's something wrong with that equation. And I think many Canadians are going, how did that happen? And that is because we have a first-past-the-post system designed for a 2-party race when we now have 3, 4, 5 parties running in elections. So people feel that their votes don't count anymore. If you go out and vote, you try and guess who's going to win and put your vote there. Well, that's a mug's game. Your vote should count for something. We should start to move to a proportional representation system in this country. And I believe that if we did that, we'd see our voter turnout increase. Right now, voters between 18 and 24, only 38.8% of them voted in the last election. 60% of young people didn't vote. And that's really a concern, because then you are really handing your vote over to somebody else. So I think we need to change that. We need to look at proportional representation. The Green Party has said they're very much in favor of doing that. And many people say, well, it would serve you well. And yes, it would. But we're also seeing now that the New Democrats and the Liberals are willing to talk about moving to some form of proportional representation. It's a reason we need more Greens in the House of Commons, because we'll keep those 2 parties to that promise should they be elected.
Well, supposedly, what I'm hearing is that for sure the NDP have said that if they become the government, they will bring in a proportional voting system for the next election. Now, Jean Chrétien said the same thing 20 or 30 years ago, and the day after he was elected, he forgot it. Christy Clark was a big supporter of proportional representation, but since she became premier, she's betrayed that as well as so many other things.
And maybe it's too early to ask Rachel Notley, but she also said she'd bring in proportional representation, so we'll see whether she holds true to that.
And that's the democratic deficit.
It is.
That these people can say this kind of thing to us.
And then not do it.
And the fact is, they cannot do it. And once they don't do it, there's absolutely nothing we can do, because they have the power. And that's the democratic deficit. They have the power. We, the citizens, are supposed to have the power. That's what the word democracy means.
Do you know, though, there's another reason that they have the power? And I think it's because they have silenced many of the MPs in the House of Commons. And that's being done by party discipline. There's a very good documentary by Sean Holman called Whipped. And it looks at how parties are determining how their members vote. And this was not always the case in Canada. We did not have the party leaders telling the members of their party how they would vote on every issue. You obviously ran on a party platform, and there are matters that have the confidence of the House. So if it involves money, a government needs to know and a party needs to know where its members will vote. But on most other issues, things that come up that weren't in your party platform, members of Parliament in the past in this country have had the right to say, my constituents feel this way, and I will answer to them, not to the party leader. And now if you don't do what the party leader wants, the party leader has the ability to say, I won't sign your nomination papers, you can't run for this party in the future. That is a very powerful tool.
And they can kick you out of the caucus the next day as well.
The next day, yeah, you're not sitting with us anymore. So you can see where that discipline is coming from, and we've just seen it grow. So one of the distinguishing features of the Green Party, and I have to say it was one of the things that appealed to me as someone who's been an independent thinker for a long time, is I didn't want someone to tell me how to vote. I do believe, I studied political science, I have a degree in political science as well as a degree in journalism, and I understand how Parliament's supposed to work. And I feel MPs, once they're elected, they represent their constituents first, not their party. So you're a member of a party, but you do represent your constituents first. We need to get back to that.
Yeah. And when we're talking about the democratic deficit, that, as Joanne just explained, is as big a part of the problem as anything else. The party leaders simply have too much control over all of the people that we elect, and the Prime Minister, as it turns out, basically has 100% control of the entire political and government machinery of the nation or the province, which is a dictatorship, and many people call it an elected dictatorship. So what would you think, for example, well, you had one question I should ask. If our children are to have a future, we need to change. So I think that is exactly true.
On so many fronts, isn't it? You know, I became a grandmother 2 months ago, and it's amazing how that kind of shifts your thinking a little bit, because I now can look at this little girl and think, what kind of a country, what kind of a world are we leaving her? And
it's enough to give you gray hair.
It is. It's enough to give you gray hair, and enough to make you go, I need to do things that maybe I've considered too risky in the past, like run for office. But you know, I really honestly believe that people are saying we need to do politics differently. So, and we have the technology nowadays to be much more informed, to be closer to our constituents. I also think if you're going to run for office, you better be prepared that if you don't do what you promised your constituents, that you're prepared not to be elected a second term. I think too often people are seeing politics as a long-term career, and they'll do almost anything to be elected. I have a good career. This would be a second one for me.
You're right again. I think the idea of professional politicians is something that we should discuss as a nation and decide what we want, not what the politicians want. Joanne, thank you so much.
It's been great to be here, Jack.
And thank you all for watching this segment of Citizens Forum.